Hey everyone, welcome to Strength Within. If you're new here, my name's Aleesha Shimeld. I'm an experienced psychologist with a particular interest in working with military members, both while they serve and afterwards. Each session, I try to find someone with a unique experience or a unique perspective to bring to the table to talk about the things that serving members and veterans find useful in maintaining their mental health from an evidence-informed perspective. This week's guest is Joshua Bailey. Josh shares his experiences, first in 9 years as an Army Reserve soldier working in the infantry, then as an ARA RAMI member also for 9 years. He also shares some of the challenges of his other permanent role, which was the Australian Federal Police. Today, we talk about the similarities and the differences between the ADF and the AFP cultures, why we want to avoid pissing contests about who did what on deployment, and why you can't judge someone's mental health just by which deployments they've been on. I am so grateful for Josh to be on the show. He raises some really interesting points around why what we don't want in the material that we consume or that we're making for other veterans is an echo chamber of the same voices being really loud over and over again, and why it's important to have different perspectives. I won't go on. I will throw over to Joshua to tell us a little bit about himself. So thanks for joining us, Josh. I was wondering if you could give me just a little summary of your time in service, which I know was split between full-time and reserve. So if you can talk us through that, that would be amazing.
Oh, hello. Thanks for having me. So I did 9 years in the Army Reserves and 9 years in the ARA. So my Army Reserve time was infantry, and then the ARA was as a RAMI fitter armourer. So pretty much 9 years equally, so 18 years all up.
And you did 9 years reserve first, and then you made the decision to go into the ARA?
Yeah, I was a choco. Yeah, I joined back in the 90s because I grew up with my grandparents and they just said you need to go and get a job. So I went and joined the Army Reserves. I was at 217 as an infantry person. I ended up being an assault pioneer and support company. And then I joined 1 Commando Regiment and got lucky enough to be selected. And then I discharged in '03. I joined in 94, discharged '03. Then I joined the AFP down in Canberra. Did a bit of time there, and then I rejoined the army when Afghanistan was on, and I was a reservist and a policeman, and I was earning bulk cash as a copper plus heaps of money tax free. A lot of guys do it from that unit, and then I met Tracy, my wife, and then we kind of both decided to move from Canberra, and then we moved up to Queensland. We both left the AFP, and I joined 9RQR, which is just down the road at Yandina. I'm on the sunny coast. Royal Queensland Regiment. Went to the Queensland Floods in 2011. Then I decided I wanted to trade and then joined the ARA as a fitter armour. Yeah, I did 9 years in the army.
Cool. And there's a few things there that I reckon I'll make sure we pull apart, because one of the things I was really keen to talk to you is that you're, like you said, you're similar to a few other people, which is that it is common for people who are full-time cops to be in the reserve. Or what we see, especially in Townsville, is you get young blokes who are leaving the ARA saying that they want to be cops. And so I thought, oh, it'll be interesting to be able to get your perspective on that. And so we obviously had a little bit of correspondence before this. And one of the things you said in your email was that, like, if you could go back and you could change anything, you probably wouldn't have joined into RAMI. You probably would have stayed in the infantry. I was wondering if you'd tell us more about that.
Yeah, thanks for that. That's a good point. I think the reason why I wanted to join to get a trade was because after you leave the emergency services, you haven't got a trade. You're just like, what happens now? And a lot of people who don't want to leave the police or the ambos or the fires, they stay because they can't envisage themselves doing anything else. They don't have that sort of, I guess, because of the trauma, sort of lessens their self-esteem and their sort of hope for the future. So they just stay in the police and they find a cushy job, somewhere. But for me, I wanted to get a trade because I didn't want to be the dude that just gets stuck. So I joined as a fitter armourer because I was previously an apprentice fitter and turner back in the late 90s. So I wanted to finish that trade off, and that's what I did. But it was kind of, I just got stuck in the workshop for kind of like 9 years, or I did courses that the unit at the time wanted me to do. So there was some times when I'd look out of the workshop door and I'd be like, you know what, I should join the army. Yeah, and I'd realise that I was in the army. Like, it was just so mundane, so boring. And that at that time, the army was just moving out of Afghanistan. We weren't going anywhere. And it was just kind of I may as well have been a civilian who I did more military activities in the reserves than what I did in the IRA by a long way. Yeah. So I could have joined the infantry and done army stuff, but that wasn't kind of why I joined. I joined to get a trade and still be in the army type thing. But I think hindsight's a wonderful thing. Resentment and regret probably aren't going to do so well. So the positives are I got my trade. I did go to SOCOM, spend some time in tag as a Ramey guy. That was good. You know, I got promoted. That was good. Work away up. But I met some friends, some really good friends. But strictly speaking, from a military perspective, what I was used to, it certainly wasn't what I expected. But that's life. I don't have to agree with it. I have to accept it. And now I've discharged now and I've moved on.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. It's a good point, right? Which is that one is that you could spend your life thinking should have done this, should have done that, and all you'll do is make yourself unhappy and you won't achieve anything. But also that you can see that hindsight's 2020 of maybe you'd have been doing different stuff, but you wouldn't have got a trade. You might not have had the location stability or the locations that you were able to have. Like it would have been a different experience in other ways being full-time infantry.
Yeah, it would
The
have
other
been.
thing I find interesting, and I was a reservist for 2 years before I joined full time, and then I was a reservist again at the back end. And I don't tend to use my reservist experience at the back end to try to speak for other people because I'm like reserve majors. To be honest, you just do whatever you want. And like anybody who pretends that that's not the case, like you do, you take the posting that you want with the CO who knows how to best utilize your skill set, and you use your skills. Like I don't think I got into uniform in 2.5 years. But at the start, I was a reserve private, right? I was a private psych examiner. And what's interesting in the reserve is there's still shit times, but you get to pick and choose your
Yeah.
tasks in a way that you're maybe not conscious of, especially if you've never served in the ARA before that. And I definitely see that with people who then go, "Oh, I'm enjoying being a reservist so much." You'll see them on deployment. I used to do lots and lots of like the Return to Australia screens on deployment, and they'll be like, "Yeah, I've been really enjoying it." And I think I might think about joining full time, but my wife kind of doesn't want me to, or my husband doesn't want me to, whatever. And then when you talk it through with them, you're like, yeah, and you wouldn't say this to them, right? But you're like, yeah, they're not quite prepared for what the
Yeah.
ARA is going to be like for them
Yeah.
because they said yes to this deployment and they were excited to say yes to this deployment. It's like, yeah, go join a battalion. There's no saying yes or no to deployments. You just go.
Yeah, that's right. And the exercises as well. So you're missing out on people's birthdays and stuff, and you're going away on exercises. You really, because I'd spent, the perception is with reservists from the ARAs that Chocos mostly, they're not very well trained, they're a bit inept, not very well equipped, they don't have any skills. Well, mate, that's bullshit. I don't know if you mind me swearing, but that's colloquially termed. That's not accurate at all. There are some very proficient soldiers amongst the reserves, especially where I was at one commando. So the idea that chocos aren't proficient is not, at least in the infantry, and I imagine in places like medical corps would be the same. That's not accurate. So when I went on exercises with Ramey, it was just I was getting nothing out of it because it was at a lower end standard where dudes just don't do, and that's not their fault. They just don't do much time outfield. It was really wasn't a waste of my time. I wouldn't categorize it as being a waste of my time, but it certainly wasn't. I wasn't growing in mastery, or it wasn't. There's nothing I really got away and learned and went, yeah, wow, I've increased my soldiering. You know, it was quite lackluster to say the least, and it was more probably about the officers, really, them justifying. One thing I found in the ARA, there was a lot of justifying your next posting or promotion, and you could almost tell when dudes were up to make that move from sergeant to warrant officer or lieutenant to captain because they were managing their soldiers differently, and it was towards the back end of the year, and you could kind of tell. I don't think they liked the idea that I worked that out. You're meant to just go along with the flow, but because I'd been around, I was able to work out one how they were managing people and what the result, what they wanted out of it. So that caused a bit of not so much friction, but they knew they couldn't befriend me because I was aware of what they were trying to do. So there's a lot of focus on next promotion, next posting, and for some people that's both of them. Whereas in the reserves, everyone wants to be there. You're not competing with anyone. You're there. You're in your own time. You're essentially a volunteer. I mean, you get paid, but you're volunteering your time, and everyone wants to be there for increase their skills or their mateship or whatever. You know. So, ARA, you're stuck there. You got a Rosso. I had a Rosso of 7 years. So if you're pilot, you got 9 or whatever. So you're pretty much there for however many years. And people know that, so they just accept the pace of which the ARA runs at, which at times can be quite manageable, quite slow. Which in Ramey it was because you're just in a workshop. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. That it's a really good observation, which is that having the structure that we have, which is that it is most often the junior members who remain in a location, and most often the more senior members, be that non-commissioned officers or commissioned officers, who will post, and as you said, on promotion and whatnot.
Yeah.
Inevitably, what you get is, and I use COs as the example because they're easy, they're big dogs to hit kind of thing, but they come in, they've got 2 to 3 years to prove themselves, and this is their shot at something huge. Or you can use OT level the same of they've really got 1 year to prove themselves as an OC to get a good report that takes them to staff college, that takes them through to command. But maybe their soldiers have been in that unit for 15 years and have seen this same cycle.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's interesting, and you've made a connection for me that I hadn't made before, which is why I'm stoked. I was like, I love having different views on here because then I'm learning as well. I'm like, yeah, of course it makes sense that in the reserve you see that less, right? Because let's say I'm a young lieutenant at a reserve unit in Adamstown, which is in Newcastle, and they, and I'm a bit shit because I'm young and I'm junior, but as I learn and as I get invested, I remain in that location unless I choose to move. But even if I get promoted, I remain there. And so I have a vested interest in not just being a strong leader, but being a strong, respected leader to these people. And I can't burn my bridges and I can't burn my connections. And it is interesting, like, and I don't know that there's a fix to it in the sense of people need to post, they need different exposure, but the theme I find myself coming back to, no matter who I'm talking to, is, gosh, we need to really be teaching people very early in the leadership continuum that, like, managing people is also about managing the person in front of you. It is not about having a token way that you manage people. And some of that is acknowledging that if your person has been there 8 years and you're going to try and push them really hard for a year, don't forget that the 7 blokes before you also tried to push them really hard.
That's a great. I'm glad you brought that up. So when I was down in Sydney, I had to do a lot in the marine space, so fixing the boats. So when I say marine space, you got two dudes. You got the dudes who actually do the work. You got the shooters. And at that time, I was just a Ramey guy, so I was with them, but I was fixing their equipment. So I was what's called an enabler. I think that's an important distinction to make. I was just with them to fix their gear. And one guy came up to me and said, Josh, what's it like in the police? And I said, why do you ask? And he said, we got these new captains come in because in SOCOM, they're all captains. They don't have lieutenants. New captain do come in, and every 2 years, they do 2-year platoon commander postings. I think they're called... I think they're called a different name because they're captains. But anyway, they're platoon commanders. And they try and justify, in that 2 years, justify their existence to get promotion to major. So by the time they hit a shooter platoon, they're looking at becoming major. So the dudes are already off it, or already... They're experienced. Some of these guys, back when I was there, they'd been 5 times in Afghanistan. So they don't need some 27-year-old dude bouncing in going, hey, I want you to do this differently, especially when they haven't deployed themselves, because this was 2016, 17. So this is 4 years after combat ops stopped in Afghanistan. So dudes were rolling through these platoons, and guys had already done it for real several times, and they'd already done several rotations through TAG. They'd already done probably ops in a battalion anyway. So guys coming through, and there's only one platoon commander in the platoon, so you're very noticeable. You're very there's nowhere to hide. So they try and ramp up PT. They try and do a lot of night ops. They try do a lot of reinvent water ops or reinvent some sort of live fire activity or something. So guys, he said, I've had enough. I'm leaving. I'm sick and tired of new dudes coming in and trying to reinvent the wheel and using me to justify their promotion to major. So guys, and I was just in Maroochydore RSL last Anzac Day, and I saw a lot of guys from Sydney there, and they'd obviously moved on because they put on a bit of weight as you do after. But a lot of them were from that era where they've obviously moved on. They've had enough post-Afghan, Chief of Army wokeness, whatever you want to call it. They've moved on because they're sick of no longer soldiering. It's now about people using them to get what they want for their own purpose, which is essentially what, perhaps, if I may be so bold as to say, what leadership has become in the army or in the defence, where people want to get that promotion or posting, and in order to justify that, they're using people below them to make themselves look as if they're got a level of mastery or proficiency. I think that's what that guy was alluding to when I spoke to him back in 16, 17. He'd had enough of being used.
It's interesting you say, I mean, you can say whatever you want, and any chance I get, this isn't an official podcast, this is just what we think. But I actually, and it's funny because I know I'm a really bubbly person. Toxic positivity has been used to describe me from time to time, and that's fine, I'll accept it. I actually think the army has always been like that. I think that when we are less experienced in the organisation, we are less likely to see it. Or when we are particularly naturally good-willed people, we are less inclined to see that in others. But I actually think it's just the nature of any organisation where you have people who are in charge of other people, but also it's literally an organisation where you do, like, if you, quote unquote, if you do the right thing, you get medals, right? Which is actually not true. if you
No.
do the right thing and the right person sees you and that person is sufficiently motivated to put you up and the person who reads it thinks that they wrote it in the right format, that's how you get a medal. Because I know people that have medals that did remarkable things, but I'm like, yeah, but so did the 5 people beside them and they didn't get it. Or people who got nothing for incredible work just because of who they were working to. So I don't think like I don't think it's cynical to go, I think there's been a lot of that, and in fact it makes sense that people just reach a point where they go, this isn't, I don't want to deal with this anymore. When I was in the Middle East the last time, which was 2021, I was supporting a lot of guys who were feeling really frustrated with everything with 2 Squadron being disbanded.
Yeah.
And I've got to be careful what I say because obviously don't want to breach anybody's confidentiality. But there were a lot of those guys who really were like, I had thought the organization would have my back, and I'm now realizing that it doesn't. And what was hurtful was not that they were like, the organization's changed. It was, shit, I'm a really smart guy and I was a bit naive to this. And I just feel for them because I'm like, yeah, because there is an implicit understanding of you work really hard for us, you do tour after tour after tour, and we'll take care of you. And then the outcome was not that they got taken care of.
Yeah, I've got a story about that in the AFP, but so sorry, I just reached back and I just grabbed my Soldier Medan, best beer coaster ever, and it's got
And
my
I've got one of those too. What have I got here?
yeah.
I do, I've got one up there.
So I didn't know what this was. Anyway, I was in the reserves, and Sergeant goes, Bales, mate, Soldier Medan, and I sat next to him, and he was typing this thing up, and I was like, what the fuck? I was like, oh yeah, I joined the army here, and I deployed to the Queensland floods, and I was a digger, but I deployed I'd done something 2 up, like a duty 2 ranks up. It's just up there, the whole thing. And we're like, oh yeah. Anyway, I'm helping him write it. And I'm like, what the fuck is this? Anyway, the CO, Colonel Bond, he goes, righto, what was I? I was Lance Corporal. Yeah, okay, so at the time I was Lance Corporal. It was at the boozer, and he goes, here you go, here's your soldier medal. And I'm like, oh yeah, sweet. And someone says to me, oh yeah, that's really important. It goes on PM keys. And I had no idea what it was. Never heard of it. No idea what it was. But it's an example in real life. And I don't know how many people are going to be as honest as I am. But I sat there and helped write the thing for this. I was, okay. I'd not to say that I didn't deserve it, I guess, more so than anyone else. I don't know. But that's an example of having a relationship with the guy who wrote the commendation. Because he was in QPOL and I was in the AFP. So we got talking about time down in the police. And I did turn up heaps. I really enjoyed my time there, so I was always there. Dudes knew me and stuff. So it's an example of what I did was noteworthy, I guess. And then plus I knew the person who was writing it enough to sit next to him. Even though I didn't know what he was talking about, I was like, yeah, man, whatever. That's an example of what you were saying is for every person who gets a soldier medallion, there's 5 people in the background who don't get recognised. And that's everyone. Like, especially in the non-combat corps, like Ramey or Ordnance or whatever, there's people in the background who don't get acknowledged. It's not a singular Man of the Year thing. So yeah, you raise a
And
good
that's
point.
not to say that you didn't deserve that, right? Or that
No,
that
but
person who gets acknowledged doesn't deserve it. But yeah, you're completely right. And a big thing is, as leaders, we all have bias. Leaders have their own bias. And a big thing for leaders is you're actually less likely to notice other people who aren't similar to you. So if someone is a really loud, outgoing leader, they're more likely to think of a loud, outgoing guy when they give a soldier medallion. They're less likely to think of the quiet guy.
yeah,
And there are some, and some, not all leaders are loud, right? Like one of the best like COs that I knew, he's not a CO now. I won't say his name only because he's like classic quiet professional. I think he would die if I said his name on the air. But I think he would be more inclined to notice quiet people because he is a quiet person. But equally, he would have to work hard against his own bias to notice other people. And so it's just the nature of the beast with any of this stuff. There was something else I wanted to say, and it was kind of what we were talking about before, but just to go back to it, because you said something really interesting around there's this perception that chocos don't know what they're doing. And there's heaps of pieces to that, and I kind of want to pull a few of them apart. One is I think it fits really well into the discussion that Woz and I had in the first episode. We were talking about how when you join the army, they make a very concentrated effort to convince you that you're better than civilians. And I think that part of it is that you have to be better than chocos, right? Because you and I, having both been chocos, know that it's a much nicer way to be in the army, to be a reservist. And I don't mean that it's easy, I mean that it's choice. It takes away some of the shittiest parts of army, but it keeps the best parts. It keeps hard work, training with your mates, lifelong friendships, going away, all that. But, you get some positives. So we have to teach their shit, because if we don't teach their shit, people would go, well, why wouldn't I just join the reserve and then I'd have to deal with this nonsense. But the other thing, and I thought, I'm so glad you said this, which is that actually often people in the reserve, especially you were dead on, which is in the medical space, they probably do have less soldierly, sailor, aviator skills because they're at the top of their game in whatever their specialty is. I've always been open about this, which was that on deployments, if I was working with so it's common that RAF squadron leaders on deployments, that like some of them are full-time, but some of them are reservists. And I remember once we had our health center manager on deployment, he was a reservist, and he was a really, really capable leader, really amazing guy. And he like sort of made a joke about it. And I was like dead serious with him. I was like, mate, if this comes to shit, I would like you to be the person who has to give me medical support because the stuff I've seen you do on this trip has been incredible. And had you spent the last 10 years not in an emergency room, but managing soldiers on RAF Williamtown, you wouldn't have the skills you have. Like he got a line into a US service person who would definitely have died from heat and dehydration if this guy was the only person who could get a line into him, and he saved this guy's life, and it was incredible. And it was truly an example of that some of those skills, you actually can't be the absolute best military officer, military person, and the absolute best medical person. And I'm sure it's the same with trades as well. The best tradesperson is unlikely to be the best military person, but we accept that the organization can support you. Like I always said, like I was pretty good with a 9mm, but I didn't have to be the best because if I have to be the best, something has gone terribly, terribly wrong before that point.
Yeah, that's very true. So the reserves offer, because it's like a volunteer thing, the reserves offered, like they offered me when I went to the Queensland floods in 2011, an opportunity to act above your rank, which is what I did in the floods there. I think I acted as a corporal. I was just a digger. And that was in operational settings. I get it, it was disaster, but I hadn't been operational settings, and I know I accept that it was disaster, but I hadn't been in operational settings with the Army or anything operational outside of the APS or the AFP before. So it offers you a chance to see how good you are for a short period of time in the reserve. We were there for 7 days. You know, you're not there for months on end like you are in the ARA. And the other thing too with the ARA is there's only one ARA. You know, so they have to be the best. There's really only one, whereas they can compare themselves to the reserves. Whereas the reserves don't compare themselves to the ARA because it's expected that you're going to be better because it's your full-time job. So when I was one commando, we didn't compare ourselves to SAS. We didn't compare ourselves to two commando because we were chocos and we just wanted to be the best we could be. It was easy. There was no comparison because we were reservists. We did a lot of time, more than the average reservist. But no way I'd compare myself when I was a shooter back in my 20s to some dude from Perth or some dude who was doing a full-time city. There's no way. They have more time to concentrate on the finer skills, so they might do, whereas you might do rappelling, well, they might do, helo casting out of a chopper or something. They might be used to doing their skills in more dangerous environments that take longer to set up, take longer to more risk assessment. You know, they might need a doctor, they might need a trauma surgeon or something hanging by because the risk is so great. We're not going to get that in the reserves because we're volunteers. The reserves do very well in operating what they can do in the shorter space of time because we've all got civilian lives to lead. And funny you talk about the RAF. When I was in the Solomons there was a RAF dude, and he was like, I don't know, I'm not sure what their rank structure is, but it was like an air marshal, vice air marshal, whatever he was. But he was an anaesthetist. He was an anaesthetist dude, like a full colonel equivalent, and he was just hanging out there to get the ASM. 30 days he was there for, and he was a high-ranking RAF anaesthetist dude, and they didn't need him because at that stage no one had been shot and killed. But all the medical dudes were RAF that had come over. There was nurses who were lieutenants and captains, and they had medics, but all the like trauma surgeon people were all RAF,
Yeah.
and they were all
And
high-ranking
that's
dudes
pretty
that
common
worked their
still
bums.
now.
Yeah, yep. That was the same on K95 as well. When I had to go to Tyndall for K95, all the medics, they had like this bus. It was like a hospital on wheels, and they were all RAF as well, all mad trauma dudes. Yeah, so interesting for that. But yeah,
You said something before, and I want to pull it out a little bit, but we don't have to get into it because I'm very conscious this is not a therapy session, and I'm not trying to make you divulge anything. But
yeah,
and there's I actually have I have a separate video I'm making about this topic as well. But anyway, I'll get to my question first or my point.
yeah,
it was just interesting what you said there, that language. You sort of said like, oh, I was doing this. Oh, it was just disaster stuff. It like wasn't on operations. And I just think it's such a strong cultural thing in the ADF, especially the army, of I did this really hard thing under shitty circumstances and I saw fucked up stuff, but it doesn't count because it didn't have the thing op at the start, right? And that's I think how it can feel sometimes. And the reason I'm
Yeah,
making a separate video is because I was in contact with a guy, X2 Squadron, many years ago, and we were going to do a video, but it was just going to be too distressing for him, basically. And so instead, I've gotten the content, and I'm going to put out a video. And essentially, it's talking about he put it in these amazingly blunt words where he said that SASR one used to stand for SAS used to stand for Stays at Swanbourne, which make me
yeah,
laugh.
I've heard that in the 80s. Yeah,
Yeah. And the other one is he said that we were very good killing our own people in huge numbers. And he's not wrong, right? He means in the sense of the number of training accidents there were and things like that.
yep,
And it's
yep,
interesting because part of why it's hard for him to talk about is because he has had some negative psychological output and he feels a lot of shame because he's like, I didn't even deploy on operations. And it's like, but actually, that doesn't change the level of traumatic experience you have. And in some ways, it can make it more challenging of, it's one thing to go to this place where I'm expecting to be harmed and I'm expecting to cause harm. It's another that wake up from in my bed one morning, think today's going to be a great day, and then there's a horrible training accident. And I think that we do a lot of serving members a disservice by not honoring the fact that like some of the worst like PTSD I've seen has been on peacekeeping ops, but also on things like Bandarache, right? In terms of body recovery
gonna
from
say
earthquakes or yeah,
Bandarache. Yeah,
or tsunamis and so and like I said, we don't have to unpack that whole thing, but I like to give voice to it because I'm like, the worst thing I think people can do when they're working with someone who is serving or ex-serving, and I don't mean working as a psych, I mean just as in you've got a new person in your workplace, it's very natural. The first question is, where'd you go? What did you do? And it's like actually that you would be surprised at what the average ADF member does, whether they have deployed or not, in terms of what they've been exposed to. Like, I won't say the specifics of it because it was pretty gruesome, but there was a very, very horrible training accident a few years ago where young people were involved, and that will stay with them their whole lives. And yeah, they never went on ops, but they dealt with stuff that most people on ops didn't deal with.
yeah. Thanks for mentioning that. I'll probably minimise a bit. So Queensland floods is on PM keys. It's one of those things you can get a national emergency medal for. You got to spend 28 days, and they give you the gong and stuff. I didn't do 28 days, but you're right in the sense that in DRA, I'm one of the wellbeing dudes that actually looks after or assists with people's mental health because it is quite stressful. It's quite. I know when I was at Coracai in 2022 after the floods that went through there, which is northern New South Wales. That was as third world as I'd seen, and I'd been to China in 1986, Nepal in 92 as a tourist. My auntie took me over there. I'd been to those countries then, and Coracai, northern New South Wales, was by far the most third world I'd seen. And I'd been to the Solomons, PNG, just got back with my wife, Tracy, in Fiji. They're pretty, no offence, but they're pretty not as advanced as we are. And Coracai in Australia was by far the most third world I'd ever seen. And I was really not so much ashamed, but disappointed that Australia could allow people to live in such conditions. Even before the floods so they had floods and they had stormwater. One had sort of collided and gone on top of each other. And you could see the marks on the houses, a different colour of where it was. And how we just allowed, even if that hadn't gone through, it's still pretty third world. And how we as a country had allowed people to live in those conditions was pretty incredible. It is traumatic. And regardless of, you might go on certain masculine promoted podcasts where they like to promote SOCOM and grunts and all this sort of stuff in Afghanistan, and that's pretty much it. Ex-police like to promote their manliness when they're in a police force and it goes on podcasts, and they like to judge others for not doing as much as they have and shit. Well, regardless of that, that's still trauma, regardless of how cool it sounds on a podcast or whether it's still, as you say, that's still trauma. Regardless of whether someone's going to judge you because they don't think it's cool, it's still something that someone has to process, and their efficacy or resilience may not be as much as the next person, or they may have the cascade effect where they've seen cumulatively from the age of 7 all the way up to 47 slow burn of trauma, and now they can't, their dissociative symptoms are too much and they're having flashbacks and they're losing space and time and losing memory and stuff of events, and that memory loss has now gone past the trauma into everyday events. They're having dissociative amnesia because of the huge amounts of trauma being exposed to. So defence and the police have people who have trying to resurrect their lives after poor childhoods. So they've already got that trauma they've been exposed to, plus training. Like my first parachute descent was an intentional water descent there at Nowra, and I nearly drowned. And then my first ever jump was a water descent out of the back of the ramp there, because you do intentional water descents, PLFs. And I've gone into the water, and the riser was stuck around my neck. So the Zodiacs come in to pick me up. The guys grabbed me, and I was choking, so they let me go, and then I drowned, and then they were pulling me, and I was choking. In the end, I had to get a jackknife and cut the risers, undo around my neck, drag me into the Zodiac. I tore a muscle there, and the doctor tells me now that it's calcified onto the bone, which is weird. I nearly drowned, but I tore a muscle in my leg. Only I could do that. But I mean, that's not ops, but it's still traumatic. And I went and saw a psychiatrist a couple of years ago, and he goes, "Mate, do you like the water?" And I fucking do not like the water. Do not like it at all. Like, I failed a swim test. In 2016, they said you got to go into a swim test to be a Ramey guy to help out with the thing. So I'd already passed one years ago to be a shooter anyway. I failed that test. It wasn't because I couldn't do it. I just had the flashback type thing.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But I was like, no, that's weak. And of course, I was seen as the weak guy. Yep, okay, get it. So my way around that now is I'm now going to volunteer for the local surf lifesaving club and be a lifesaver, do the bronze medal. Side issue. But that jump still caused some sort of trauma, I suppose, or some sort of negative sort of had some negative effects. And that's not an ops. That's still a risk-taking situation. And then fast roping as well. If you're fast roping out of a chopper, you just thought of gravity, and then your knees, or if you fall badly, man, someone falls on you, or if you fall on someone, mate, that's another example, especially if you fast rope onto a ferry or something where it's going like this and going like that, mate. So, and they're just training. That's still going to cause, and if you imagine if you were on a construction site and you got anything near something like that happened, mate, that'd be national news.
And it would be work cover for
In
years.
defense, but it's like, yeah, man, it was a Friday when I nearly drowned, and they're like, whatever, man, go and have a few beers, get on the piss and come back on Monday. And that was it. If that happened these days, I think there'd be more to say. And it's not the Army's fault. I think it was just a shit water entry on my part. Like, you can't blame anyone. But it's a good point that you raise, is you don't have to be affected by something. It's not only ops that affects people, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's just the nature of the job, really.
I get really passionate about that, because I've just seen too many people who put off getting treatment, that had they just got treatment immediately or within, I mean, what we would say, if we use your example as an example, right, what we would say is we wouldn't want to treat you immediately. We would want to see, are you able to process it in your own time? And unfortunately, what we know is that because the environment you're in, you probably wouldn't have been able to, because a lot of those kind of don't be weak, all that, it's going to stop you from your brain doing the things you need to do to process it. But then if it didn't work, then like 3 months later, it's a couple of sessions, you process it, you're all good. And then people leave it because of the shame, and because there's this idea of it was, I made a mistake on training or whatever. And we know that the treatment becomes so much harder. And that's why I'm quite vocal about it. And I know exactly what you mean around intentionally, I've tried to get people with different views on this podcast, and I knew I was taking a risk in starting with the ex-SASR guy, because I don't want people to think that that's the whole podcast, because it's definitely not. Because there's a lot of great stuff, and I want to get Dan Pronk on the podcast, because I think from a medical perspective there's interesting stuff.
Yeah.
What the internet does not need is a bunch of guys sitting around talking about how fucking great all the stuff that they did in Afghanistan was. Like, they did need that, and I think that's great, that's out there. We don't need more of that. We actually need people to go, hey, what about this, or what about that? There was a client that I had, and I don't think he'll mind me sharing this story, mostly because I got permission. He was interesting. Like, as you said, people come into defense with pre-existing, and not necessarily trauma, but we would say adverse childhood experiences, like violence or conflict or whatever as a child. People come into defense because they like the stability and they like that kind of element. Came in, pretty good career, pretty in some ways stock standard in terms of the role he did, some, kinetic engagements in Afghanistan. What he was seeing me for was because he had been outfield, and you know how when you're outfield and you change over who's on picket or whatever, often there's a communal laptop that's just got videos and shit on it, so people can just watch videos or movies, or someone just kind of puts their laptop in the CP and they just rotate through. And he had gotten up to do his shift, and when he jumped on, he'd seen the folders, and then one of the folders had an interesting name, which he'd be the first to admit he looked at because he was like, that looks like it's porn and it's the middle of the night and I've been outfield for 3 weeks. I want to look at the porn folder. Got in there and then noticed like a weird subfolder. And then when he opened that subfolder, it was child pornography. And he had never, ever been exposed to anything like that, which is good because you do not want to have been exposed to anything like that. And he was, an adult male who at this point had a small child.
Yep.
And he just like immediately like he was like dry retching and he had to like talk himself down because what he wanted to do was just he was like, who the fuck's laptop is this? He wanted to just go and slit someone's throat basically in their sleeping bag, right? But he was like, I can't do this. I have to report this and everything. And it was interesting because that had stuck with him in such a challenging way. But then there was nothing in our culture. And by our culture, I mean the ADF, I mean being Australian, I mean being Australian man. There was nothing in there to say, hey, mate, that's fucked up and it's okay if you need help with that. And so then he would often be like, why is this bothering me? I shot this guy over here and I didn't care. And it's like, yeah, well, what did you think of that guy? And he's like, well, he shouldn't have been there. He shouldn't have gone through the checkpoint. I'm like, cool, shouldn't have gone through the checkpoint. That's why that didn't bother you. Like, we all bring our different perspective. And so I get very passionate about like trauma can mean a lot of different things to different people. And in terms of whether you can have PTSD from what he saw, you can't, right? Because PTSD is a specific diagnosis and you have to have it has to have been a certain kind of an event. But that doesn't mean you can't have had a negative impact on your mental health or that you can't benefit from treatment. And I mean, that's a whole other thing where you don't have to get down that rabbit hole. But I think a lot of veterans still think that if I'm unwell, it has to be PTSD. And if it's not PTSD, I'm not unwell. And it's like, no. There's lots of different ways to be unwell. And also that you don't have to have a diagnosis. You can just not be the best version of yourself. And there can be stuff you can work on around that.
Yeah, when I was in the AFP, someone showed me a statement of facts and it was to do with child incest. So when I was down in ACT, the incest, there's 2 rules. There's child under 10 and child under 16. They actually break it down. I was like, fucking righto. And I read the first page because they were in the watch house. And I was a watch house dude and you had to know who was in there. And they went, I read this, not sure. And mate, I got about a page in and I couldn't read anymore. And one of the SACAT people was the sexual assault child abuse team people. They were like, oh, you're weak. Fuck you. You would never make a detective, blah, blah. And I was like, fucking thanks anyway. It was I'd had very little to do with child sex assault. Plenty to do with child abuse, but not that. So I was pretty lucky, but just to read was pretty notable. I was pretty shocking. I was pretty difficult. I've never seen or been exposed to child pornography. He's quite right to react. And I think it's also the distrust as well because of the values and morals that we hold within defence. For him to open that up, it sounds like he may have been like a sort of a rank which was a respectable rank in commander troops and stuff. So if you're opening up that laptop and you see that and it's open for everyone, like open source, then that is a complete breach of trust on almost every level possible. It goes against everything we're taught in the army or defence or as a principled person. That's probably, well, you know better than me, probably one of the reasons why he would react so strongly. I mean, that's just...
A big part for him was that he was like, in the moment, it was just visceral because it's actually really common, and you would have had that experience when you read it, which is that it's a very confronting thing, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But afterwards, it was, what the fuck is wrong with this guy? Like, how much more fucked up shit is there somewhere else? Like, this was the laptop he was willing to bring out field kind of thing. At what point are your norms shifted? Which I thought was a really interesting point. But it's interesting what you said about the team, like the team being like, you're weak, you wouldn't cut it. And it's like, again, it fits into, like, those beliefs are really unhelpful to the people that aren't of the group. But for the people who are of the group, it's a protective thing that they tell themselves, right? Is, I can tolerate this because I'm tough. Whereas what we know from the evidence is that trauma accumulates and that you can only be exposed so many times. Like people do not last in those kind of units dealing with like intense like sexual child abuse or child pornography or things like that. They have to rotate in or out or it affects their interpersonal relationships.
Well, it's funny you should say, like, criteria or of the PTSD and the DSM-5-TR does have a sentence where it talks about police officers exposed to child abuse.
And yes, because of the volume.
Yep. That's exactly what it says. And I think in criteria B3, which talks about dissociation, talks about police once again. So the fact that something like the DSM actually talks about specifically a certain role should indicate that there's so much data out there that it's highly likely that you are going to develop negative effects and impairment from that exposure. Yeah, interesting. But I try and school some of the police on Instagram and they're not interested. So it really depends on the culture, because I think the culture would reflect whether or not a person is interested in receiving certain information or not. You know, if you're gonna, I think we need to look at the culture as well. I mean, I kind of minimise because I think that's the way I've been brought up, you know. But and you've picked up on that, which is really good. And I think that's probably one of the things that would be difficult to change within the culture, but also needs to change so that we accept everyone for who they are, and then we accept what we do or have done is actually something you can get trauma from, but also something to be proud of as well, so we don't get to that sort of grief or negative or resentment every Anzac Day that some people have. I have a few people contact me this Anzac Day where they've been disappointed with their service or have negative sort of views on how they served. They should have done more or they could have done less or whatever. For some reason, this Anzac Day, I don't really know why, as opposed to others. I went on a podcast last Thursday with Aaron, the ex-Vicpol in the US, and we talked about grief, resentment and that around Anzac Day, and they have Veterans Day over there. I think there's a lot of comparison of people's jobs to each other, and that's one thing that Instagram has brought out, or social media has brought out, podcasts and that, is the comparison of roles, as you were talking about, you know, the kinetic roles in Afghanistan versus someone who's just served on a couple of minor operations, you know, whether it be Solomon Islands or Timor or Bougainville versus SOCOM and Afghan. And that's what we've done, is the comparison has devalued someone else's experiences when that really isn't the case. It shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, because I teach junior psychs, and when I do that in a defense context, I'm always really clear with them, which is that I go, one, I mean, no mental health professional should ever be making someone feel their experience is devalued. That's like Psych 101. But especially in defense of that, there is this idea of like, oh, that they went to Afghanistan and they just went to East Timor, and I'm like, cool, what year did they go to East Timor? Because that'll
Yes.
change like
Yes.
what they were theoretically exposed to. And it's also
Yep.
true for Afghanistan. Afghanistan had fighting seasons and non-fighting seasons, and there was a specific terrible run there,
Yep.
but
There was.
just the nature of where they were doesn't dictate what they're exposed to. Like, you have to actually ask the questions. And it goes the other way too, which is that some of the less experienced psychs might go, I'm wondering if this is trauma because of, they've deployed. Okay, well, what does that mean? Let's unpack what was their experience of deployment. And I'm deliberately not going to use examples because I don't want to risk devaluing someone's experience, but there are places that I deployed to that were truly like a holiday camp. And I would be the first to say that of my own experience. But could I guarantee that 2 years before they were like a holiday camp? No. And in fact, they probably weren't. Or there could have been a different experience, or especially it depends on the role. Like for medical professionals, medics have some of the highest rates of PTSD. And that's, true, not just in the military, right? If you look at health professions as well. And part of that is the unpredictability of it. So you could have someone who goes, yeah, that deployment's easy. And you're like, yeah, it was easy for you because you didn't have these 3 events, but the trip after you had those 3 events. And
Yep.
so trying to use they deployed to wherever as a shortcut to they had these experiences, I just find is super unhelpful. It's where people come unstuck, and it's where I understand why people want to get into that pissing contest of like, oh, well, he didn't really do this or whatever. I'm like, yeah, but you got no idea what someone brings into an event either, or what they brought out of the event. Like if we use your example with the boat, it just makes me laugh because trauma is obviously like my kind of my specialty, of that idea of just go away, have a couple of beers, and we'll see you on Monday. It's like the exact opposite of what should happen, because we know that in order to process it, the best thing that could have happened is that you be given space to process it, either writing, talking, thinking, however it works for you. But we would have like said from a trauma informed perspective, we would have said, don't have any beers for 2 nights because we actually want you to get really good quality sleep those first 2 nights after a potentially traumatic event, because that will help you to build the neural pathways that you need.
Yeah, well, this is back in 1999 when it was all, man of the year type. You're a commando, you're invincible. That was the attitude. That was genuinely the attitude. You're a commando, you're invincible. And some of the guys even had the of past selection, so therefore I don't need to train again attitude. And at the time, you really didn't know, because research and prior before internet, and personal trainers weren't even a thing. So it was just run the hardest PT session ever and fucking off you go. It was kind of, you're invincible. You've done the course, which means you've reached an era of invincibility. And for me, when I was in AFP, I think there was a guy, unfortunately died in Afghanistan, first SAS bloke, and they were asking, and I've actually said, Australian soldiers don't die in combat, mate. I actually had that attitude because of the culture that I've been brought up to. So when a member died overseas, I was like, fucking what?
Yeah.
What? That doesn't happen. I was really surprised. I remember being at Woden police station there, and I was looking on the TV going, fucking, no, that doesn't happen. I was really, because we were so entrenched that we can't die. There's no fucking way.
Yeah.
And then when I was training on the OMD for Afghanistan for the ski, what we called the ski trips. When you say fighting seasons, what we used to call is the ski trip, which is winter. So one company or one commando used to do SOCOM or the SOCOST sort of over Christmas. And I was on the OMD for that. And then it sort of came out, a couple more blokes had died. And then when Greg Sher passed away on the 4th of January of 2009, that's when it really hit me. Because I decided not to go. I had a choice at the start of the AFP or go overseas, and I decided not to go. And I ended up meeting my wife, Tracy, so it wasn't a bad thing, but I kind of regretted, from a psychologist, because I'm provisional, one day I'll be like you, an experienced, I hope, be an experienced person. As a therapist, I don't regret not going to Afghan, but as a soldier, I kind of do regret not going to Afghan. But that shit happened. That's life. There's nothing I can do about it. I just have to accept it. So the idea is that we were invincible. We were SF. Regardless of whether you're a reservist or whether you're an ARA, you still pass all those fucking tests. And so when guys started dying overseas, that was a real shock. I think that was a shock for everyone that
So
actually.
I remember it. I remember the feeling that you're talking about of like when that first sort of KIA was announced. I think they literally, even on the news, they were like, "This is the first Australian casualty of war since like Vietnam." Like, yeah.
Yeah. I was like, what? This doesn't fucking happen. And so that's when it sort of occurred to me that the hyper masculinity may have worked back then, but maybe I was lied to suit the people, the persona that the people wanted to have in that particular unit. Maybe, I don't know. But having said that, though, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to go out and commit war crimes or any of that other shit that you hear from the left. That doesn't mean that at all. But
I'm very left, and I don't think that's not. Yeah, yeah. Like, don't confuse those two constructs.
no. Well, yeah. I mean,
I'm just teasing you. Like, I think, and this is something I know will come up repeatedly on the podcast, but it's something I speak to all the time. Of that, to think that we can 15 years after an event judge those things with any understanding of the context, either internal to the individuals or to the situation when people have deployed that many, I think that's hugely arrogant to think that it's okay to now try to do that. I think it's appropriate to go, can we do better? But some of the language and the way that people have been attacked, I think, is completely not okay. And to be honest, part of me getting out was shaped by some of that, was by how those guys were treated. I was supporting people who were in the Middle East. I was in the Middle East, and it was a weird time due to COVID. We couldn't travel, and so I was doing a lot of remote sessions, like via video, to other places. And I'm deliberately being a little bit vague. And what you've got is people who the Australian government are putting into extremely fucked up, dangerous, potentially traumatic situations, and saying, "Hey, go make snap judgments, do this, do that." But also, tomorrow you're getting a call from the AFP about this investigation, and if you don't answer, we'll think you're obstructionist. And it's like, it really appalled me. And it's a shame because I still love serving ADF members. That's why I put the work into this stuff. But at a higher organizational level, I've really lost faith in what was happening.
yeah, I know. When I did some work with the RSL, I'm no longer with the RSL, and thankfully, I'm no longer with the RSL. And we did try and assist some blokes who had what you're discussing there, and I was kind of impeded by the boomers who had done some time in Vietnam and had that attitude of, well, you didn't do it as tough as I did, and you guys don't count. It was quite an incredible attitude from them. I ended up leaving the RSL because of it. But from the exposure I had to some of the dudes, it seemed pretty. I think a lot of confusion as to why that would occur, and then they couldn't find anyone to listen. And I think some of the mouthpieces they had for those guys probably weren't the correct dudes. They could have chosen better, but you're not to know. It's just the way it is. I got a new account after that because it got tied in with the RSL, and I just, fuck this type thing. And I was doing uni. But one of the things, probably moving to a segue, one of the things I really had to do was work on my communication and not devalue people and not be so critical of others. When I first started Instagram, kind of a bit of a yobbo and a kind of a bit of a, I guess, a comparer, or someone who had done some things that I was proud of, and then it'd be like, well, fuck, who's this guy or who's this person? Or, I didn't consider other people's experiences. So one of the things I've really had to do was communicate more softly and be completely non-judgmental and accept others. And I think you were one of the ones who contacted me and went, hey, you kind of need to fucking calm it down. But you did it very professionally. So I always think of you sometimes when I go and do a reel and trying to. Maybe you said to me, there's a lot of people spilling shit on the gram. Well, that's my words, but that's what you're telling me. So I always keep that in the back of my mind as well, to be as factual or be as non-judgmental and be as friendly and helpful as possible. It's one of the things I've really had to do after leaving the army. Because in the police, you just judge the fuck out of everyone. That's pretty much.
I think that's so protective, right? In the sense of like, yeah, we should all aspire to be non-judgmental. Equally, the police, even more than the ADF, and I would challenge anyone who disagrees with this. It is a role where every day you step outside your house, you drive to work in your car, and then you get put into situations that the average person couldn't deal with.
Yeah,
And some of what will keep you alive is unconscious bias, right? And
yeah,
some of that bias is incorrect and is not serving you well. But if the risk of it being false is that you get hurt, then fuck it. If the wall is too high, the wall is too high, right? And it's very challenging then to adjust your life around that. And there's a reason that a lot of people who are in the police, one, there's a reason that the police have a lot of challenges with mental health because culturally there's different stuff there. But also often the symptoms that people who've been in the police force a long time are they become emotionally distant, children find them judgmental, etc. And it's like, yeah, because if for 20 years making snap judgments stopped you from getting stabbed, you'll keep making snap judgments. And it's really hard to
yeah.
like, so I make jokes all the time about what a lefty I am, but I'm also like, yeah, but I understand where all those kind of behaviors come from because it's what keeps you safe and you'll keep doing what keeps you safe.
Well, that's true because it's, I think, it's learned response and you're referring back to your experiences. And if those experiences have assisted you, then they'll continue to assist you in the future. And then when those experiences guide you into the next traumatic experience, it doesn't go, your schema is it's going to work out like this. And then there's things happen which are an affront to that schema. You're like, fuck, and then it adds to the trauma again. So you're like, well, fuck, the last guy I dealt with had a knife and I maintained distance and I said this and I approached this and it didn't work, but it worked the other 4 times and I still got stabbed. You know what I mean? So there's that. And I never got stabbed. That's fine. But that's just how whatever's going to keep you safe or whatever is going to, there's two things in the police. It's whatever's going to keep you safe and it's whatever is going to, the outcome that is going to not get you negatively viewed by the organisation. So there's two. So in defence, yeah, you behave in accordance with your values and your morals and rules of engagement, and the dude's there with a gun, he's trying to shoot you, shooting back, yeah, fuck, whatever. No worries. Whereas in the police, the dude might be holding a knife and you might be 2 meters away and the guy might be trying to threaten you, but there'll be someone back in an office going, did you really mean to shoot him? Or should you have really used that much OC spray? Or could you, it's a totally different kettle of fish. And then you've got civilians and everyone's got a camera. And if you're talking to someone at night time, they don't like you, they'll hold the phone in your face and there's the light in your face as well. Simply because you're a policeman, they think they're hard done by because everyone's entitled. So there's a lot more considerations in the back of your mind when you're dealing with someone on the street, because you know that if it all goes pear-shaped, one, you can get injured, and two, there'll be some dude in a suit wanting to make a career out of your event from internal investigations, you know? So
As well, the Australian public in some ways, and it's actually a beautiful thing. The Australian public can be very naive to the realities of the world, and I mean that genuinely. That I think that that's good. They are able to be naive to the realities of the world because there are bodies in place that are protecting them from the realities of the world. But a big one you see is that whenever there is someone that has been killed by police, the question will always be, why didn't they shoot them in the leg? Or why didn't they shoot the knife out of their hand? Why didn't they do this? And you're like, if only it were that easy. If only adrenaline pumping through you, those are the decisions you could make. And I think that in some ways it's like, so you say that the police are terrible, but you also apparently think that they're all John Wick essentially. And so I think that there's a lot of it is just that, and police and ADF are the same. They don't defend themselves, right? In terms of organizationally, they don't defend themselves. And in some ways, I think that's correct. I think it's important as an organization to stand up and go, we fucked up, we carry bias, we do this. I think that is important. Equally, I just once would love to see like a police commissioner or like the CDF or someone get up and go, yeah, look, maybe they should have done it this way, but you know what? You try it. That was the end of a 13-hour shift and people are tired and they
yeah,
are humans. They are not law enforcing robots.
Fair enough. You know, you wouldn't see that in Australia. I feel that the top brass, both in police forces and defence, are too aligned with politicians, too aligned with you know, when I first joined the police back in '04, we were told we were apolitical. There is no political affiliation. We tell the government what we think they should hear. Well, that's definitely changed now. You see the commissioners and that now, there's nowhere near that. You can see there's a bit of a alignment there with the government of the day. I don't know whether that's funding or whatever, but
I think that's a pretty
sorry, you go.
common criticism of that. Once you reach a certain rank level in the military, you are becoming more of a politician and less of a manager, less tactical, and which is why some people don't want to do it, right? But it's hard because it's also then how you affect change.
Yeah, I think it all started with Morrison. I don't want to drop any names, but he was definitely one who started it.
Excited. And again, I'm always happy to argue with people on here. There's I don't disagree. I think you're right. But some of what he said, that idea of like when he came out after the ADF scandal and was like, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept, I was like, this is amazing. And then some other stuff happened. I was like, oh, we're taking this a little bit further than I was expecting us to take this.
Yeah.
But the thing I find interesting is if you look at, like, obviously, you know, we've talked a little bit about the Afghan inquiry, and a huge thing of that is that you had leaders saying, we had no awareness this was happening, but equally, please don't take our medals because we were doing a really great job of managing people. And you're like, no, you got to choose one. You got to choose one or the other. Did you not know, in which case you lose your commendations? Or did you know, in which case you also get charged?
Yeah, you're right. Sorry for interrupting. There was a disconnect. That's what you're saying. There's a disconnect between. So the analogy I use, and I've seen used before, is if a soldier spends $7 on his government credit card, then he gets charged, and it's a big fine. Someone like the CDF or Commander SOCOM, he goes and fucks up royally in Afghanistan, and it's like, oh, well, she'll be right. There's no recourse. So the higher up you go, commensurates with the lack of recourse that is it seems to occur. You know, so. And politicians spend money they shouldn't all the time, and they just go, pay it back. Some dude from one RAR spends $10 on a card that he shouldn't. Then he's charged by the CO and he's getting 2 days loss of pay. There needs to be a bit of, when people, the higher up you are, the greater influence you have, the more people are going to see your actions. So those dudes that you're talking about who don't take my CSM or CSC or whatever it is away, everyone looks at that and goes, well, mate, I've now lost your respect. And then that can be erosion of the values and morals of which we serve by. You start questioning them, and then people start leaving. And all of a sudden they're like, hey man, we need to get people from other countries to come and serve our defence force. I don't know why. Well, you need to have a look at yourselves. And the fact that they haven't had a look at themselves just highlights the disconnect between those they hold accountable and themselves.
I think that had they gone, this was wrong, and my first act of reparations is that I'm stripping myself of these medals, I think would have made a huge difference to how that whole thing rolled out, how it was perceived in the organisation, out of the organisation.
Yeah, it's really a shame. Really rocked all of defence and all of SOCOM as well. That was just unrequired. Yeah, right.
One of the reasons that I was really keen to talk to you was, as we sort of said, is that you do have that dual experience, having been both in a serving police officer and a serving defence member, and noting that something we see, at least, I mean, in North Queensland, this is really common, is young members going, fucking hate the army, I'm going to get out, I'm going to join the police force. I would love to hear what you think. And look, maybe that's kind of in the dad advice space, but when you hear that, what are your thoughts of do you think it's a good jump to make, from the army to the police? Or
I get blokes ask me all the time, saying, I'm going to join the AFP. Fuck, mate. I tell them no. But in Queensland Police, I say yes, because it's two different beasts.
Yeah.
So in QPOL, there's still that attitude that you're being overwatched by the bosses above you, and there's the expectation that the community has upon police. Yep, no dramas. But if they were going to join any of the services, I'd say the fireys. So the fireys have a tremendous camaraderie, and they have a break between trauma. We all know that they sleep whilst on shift, and that's just the nature. But there's a lot of training for the fireys. There's a lot of training in the army. Then they go and do the operations. Similarly to the fireys, training, job on, rest, training, job on. That's similar to what you'd be in defence on a smaller scale. Joining the police is cool, but understand that there's civilians who've joined the police. They're not ex-army and then go in. So if you go in all masculine and all hyper and stuff, there's going to be a jolt. So what I would say to people is, it's great you've been in the army, but you have to understand that not everyone has been in the army, not everyone knows, or everyone cares about what you've done. Chicks aren't going to throw themselves at you. That's not what's going to happen. And also, you can't shoot first questions. Like there's a greater conversational piece that needs to take place in the police before you go and get contact. You know, in contact, you get bang rounds. It's cool. You know, even to say anything, you can just shoot. Whereas in the police, you've got to talk. Then you've got to maybe spray. Then you've got to handcuff. Then you've got to report afterwards. You've got to do the whole reporting thing.
Yeah.
So there's patient is big in the police, not so much in the army. You just kill the enemy, seize hold ground, sweet. In the police, you arrest someone, bring them before the court, then you present what's happened for the purposes of that person getting rehabilitated. So there's a different attitude there. So a long-winded way of saying that you have to accept what you don't know and learn that. So you've got to open yourself up to a new set of skills. You can't just join and go, I'm going to go to tactical, because that's not the way it works. There's a lot of blokes want to do. I'm going to go be man of the year in the tactical response team. They try out and they fail. They're like, well, how the different beast? They have to do the time. They have to learn about being a police officer. Yes, you can carry the morals and values and hard work with you, but it's a different uniform, different job. So they have to accept that there's a greater learning, and they can't just wade in and think the chick's going to throw themselves and be the man of the year. It's not going to be like that. More understanding and more care. That's why you get a diploma of public safety, because that's what it is, public safety. Whereas in defence, kinetic, well, you're there to kill the guy. Totally different.
Yeah.
No,
That's really good.
Right.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's such a great point of, and it's funny as you're saying that, and I don't know the actual data on this. I'm just thinking anecdotally in my head. The people that I know who have gone from defense to police have ultimately ended up not lasting in the police, often because they didn't enjoy it, or because they realized the stuff that was bothering them about defense, that they kind of went, that's a defense problem, I'll leave and it'll stop bothering me, didn't stop bothering them and got worse in police, and police was not a very supportive environment to process it. But then I know people who did 20 years in defense and are now doing 20 years like in fireys and are finding it very rewarding in terms of the values are aligned, the mateship is aligned. As you say, job on, job off. It's a different kind of model. So I think that's a really good point. I know fireys is also really competitive. Like it's not necessarily the solution. But no, that's a good point. Thank you for that.
Yeah, the police are very, very unsupportive of, well, at least when I was in the ACT police, are very unsupportive of mental health. So I was on stress leave, and they basically said to me, "Look, mate, we think you should move on, you know." And so I did, and I got the union to type out my resignation, and they said, "We'll accept it today." And that was the way it was. I interestingly, and I say this on all my podcasts I go on, and this is probably one of my motivators to become a psychologist. I don't know why, but when I had a car accident, and I rang 000 because we were both trapped in the car, and I rang 000, had to kick my way out, and the driver was trapped. And Tracy, my wife, was working O. She answered, and I was telling her about it, and you could hear the horn in the background, and everything was smashed. Anyway, I got taken to hospital after. The driver got taken to hospital, and I was like, fuck, whatever. Anyway, I walked out, with no shirt on, because the superintendent turned up. He didn't want police officers to look. He didn't want the public to see a policeman walking out of A&E with boots in his hand, no shoes on, and a police shirt. So I walked out with no shirt on. Because this was after a car accident that I was in. I can send you photos if you want. But we were doing 120, and we hit a concrete light pole, a tree, and a sign, and the driver's door got ripped off. The light pole came down. We were lucky to survive. They had to cut a couple of doors out to get the driver out. She was in hospital 3 weeks. They expected she wasn't going to make it, so what they did is they got the recognition ceremonial guys to practice funeral stuff.
Yeah.
It was pretty serious, and I really struggled with that for fucking years after. Years after. I don't know why, like years after. What I did, I had a really bad girlfriend beforehand. She was in the job as well. It was really bad, and so I really struggled. It's the first time I'd ever come across anyone with borderline type symptoms, where there's a reality and then there's her reality, and I really struggled to understand. After an interesting childhood I'd had, I wanted to be accepted by this person. So if I could be accepted by this person, because I couldn't get accepted by my stepfather, so I strove to be accepted by this person and just kept going back. And the relationship got dissolved, and colloquial term psycho. It's a bit of a colloquial bloke term, but there was a lot of impulsivity, immoderation, like lacking restraint, impulsive behavior, yelling, screaming. She hit me once, refused to leave the house, blah, blah, blah.
Mm.
So in the end, and the sort of harassment and that continued, but she was like, oh, he's harassing me. Anyway, I looked her up on the computer, police computer. So I was getting therapy for the car accident and that. I was drinking heavily. And one day I was 0.103, drinking 0.103, and the dude just goes, oh, I just sit in the passenger seat. So that's the right thing to do there, but it's not the right thing for long term.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I looked her up a couple of times because I was paranoid, but I was on the police system. The AFP found out about it, had to go to court. It's my own fault. But one thing I didn't realise, and one thing you don't hear about with PTSD, is the lack of thought process or understanding that your actions have consequences. Yeah. So I was in my deliberation, the lack of deliberation that I had, or lack of foresight, and that was something that I wouldn't normally. I just wouldn't do that normally. So it's one thing that I kind of hold against myself, how I could be so dumb. And so the AFP just went, oh, mate, you're on sick leave, plus you did this, time to go. But I'd done so much, I'd been overseas a couple of times. I've got letters saying this bloke saved this person's life or rescued this person, or this bloke done a great job. But they didn't matter. So I had, when the 2 squadron guys were going through what they were doing, it's at a higher level than my level, higher. But I I knew how they felt, because it's so sudden and there's no warning, there's no prodromal warning to when someone's going to betray you, organisational betrayal. And for what purpose? You're like, hang on a minute.
I thought they had my back and they don't. Yep. Yeah.
And then for them just to go, fucking catch you later, and you resign via email. Yeah. So when those dudes were going through what they were going through, I really tried hard through the RSL to actually assist. The rest is history, and I've moved on from that now. Organisational betrayal can occur, and it occurs a lot in the police, and that's one of the reasons why when dudes go, I'm going to leave the army and I'm going to join the police, you go, all right, mate, well, you're not going to tell them organisational betrayal is going to occur, but you want to understand exactly.
I think that a lot of ADF members don't realise how well the ADF takes care of people. And there's flaws in that, right? But just fundamentally, they do. And I don't want to speak too much about, I guess, what the official response is from police in terms of mental health stuff. I can only speak to what I know anecdotally. And that is that I know psychs that have worked in both areas, and they would be the first to say that the public has this perception that ADF members are the ones that need all the help for PTSD. They actually are able to access a lot more help than police officers are. And I'm not saying that they do access it, because there's a big stigma around it, right? But organisationally, there are actually a lot more supports in place. I also just want to speak to what you said about you're looking up your girlfriend, it's not a good idea, but you kind of don't know it's not a good idea. Not so much for you, because you're a psych. So in terms of the brain, right, and again, I know I'm telling you to suck eggs, but this is for people at home. My mum loves it when I get the brain out. Just sidebar, I was the first person in my family to get straight into university, so I'm like, they're very proud of me, which is very nice. In terms of the pathways in our brain that activate when we're under threat, it's all stuff like right in the middle, important stuff here, right?
Okay.
And what happens is that when those pathways kick off, and if I can be clever, I'm going to take the brain apart even to show it. Can I do it? I can do it. So, and this doesn't show the complexity as well. I used to have a different one that had all the different bits. But when these kick off, the front part of your brain literally is unable to function. And that front part is, hang on, putting it back together, this bit here. This is where all your grown-up thinking happens. This is where all your like, is it a good idea to speed through this traffic light? Is it a good idea to look up my ex? That's where those decisions happen. And so when someone is under threat, and being under threat could be legitimately they're under threat right now, they're being attacked, this bit shuts down because our brain doesn't need it. Our brain keeps us safe. And the problem is that when someone has a prolonged reaction to trauma or a prolonged stress reaction, they operate with a reduced level of functioning here all the time. And so it's interesting what you said, and I hope that you're able to give yourself some compassion around that, because I'm like, yeah, it makes perfect sense to me, which is that you're like, you're an AFP officer. Of course, you shouldn't be using the system to look her up. But in your head, you're like, but is she stalking me? Is this happening? Yeah. It's really hard to make those distinctions, which is exactly why what we want is a system where people can be supported to get treatment for their mental health so that then those things can resolve. And the other little one, and I have to say this because I live in Townsville, so I feel like any chance I can get, I say this is remembering that children who experience neglect, be that physical, cognitive, emotional, or are born to mothers who are using drugs or alcohol, they will always be impacted in this bit, and their impulse control is not very good. Because people often talk about, how do we solve the the child crime problem in Townsville. I'm like, to be honest, it's actually got to be solved about like when these kids are being raised. You're not going to punish them into stopping this behavior because the punishments won't work because their brain isn't even registering it. Anyway.
Wow. No, that's pretty cool. I'd probably forgotten all that because that's good. That's awesome. Thanks for that.
Well, I
But
just got to find my other brain. My other brain lets me show the bits a bit better. I was kind of pointing at a very general area then. But the key thing is that our threat response shuts off the parts of our brain that let us make like good decisions, and they put us very much just on autopilot.
okay. Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Right, I've taken us on a sidebar there. Is there anything else that you wanted to say before we wrapped up?
No, I think that's pretty much it. Yeah, thanks. Thanks so much. It's been quite informative, actually. I've really enjoyed it. It's good.
Good. No, I'm glad. I feel like you've given me some stuff to think about. I also think it's good to have like you and I have probably slightly different views on stuff, and that's good too, right? Like what I don't want is an echo chamber, and I actually love that you who can kind of see like you're still living some of that kind of hypermasculinity stuff, but you can see that some of it's not helpful, and that's good because it's really easy for me as a female to go, hey, doing that's not helpful. And it's like, yeah, but the pressure's not on me to do it to begin with. So I think it can be really helpful
Yeah,
for like a big guy to be like, actually, maybe these beliefs didn't always serve me the best that they could
I
have. Or
think I think we were lied to when I first joined Commandos. I think we were fucking lied to. But sorry, I shouldn't swear. But I think there was a bit of a misrepresentation of realism. I mean, you certainly need to be resilient. You need to be tough, and they talk about toughness, not fitness or something. And you certainly need to be dedicated. And there was made shit there. The idea you're invincible is now quite farcical. But that's we live and learn.
And resilience is such an interesting concept because I feel like it's constantly touted in defense spheres, but it misses the key point, which is resilience is not that you do not get stressed or distressed. Resilience is that you experience something stressful and then you use your coping strategies and you move forward, right? But there is a period where you're allowed to be distressed. And I feel like people think resilience means never getting upset. And you're like, no, that's being profoundly unwell. If you never get upset, you're actually not a well person. It's about being able to use that, move forward.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. Yeah, yeah. Thanks so much for inviting me on your podcast. I really enjoyed it. Thanks so much. I
No,
always like
no,
hanging out with psychs, particularly like senior ones, so I can learn and be a bit of a sponge. And I think
yeah.
I could do like yourself. There's a lot of value in people like you and I working in the psychology space for people.
I want to say thank you again to Josh for taking the time to chat with me today. I really appreciated the unique experiences that he brought to the podcast and his willingness to share times when some of his strongly held beliefs around what it means to be weak or strong or what things can impact us have not always been helpful to him. A reminder that none of what Josh or I talked about is health advice, and if you do feel that you need some support following the pod, please take a look in the information sections wherever you're engaging with this, as there are contact details for Open Arms, some emergency services, Lifeline, and things like that. I also want to remind everyone, although I think it's pretty clearly implied because we go a little bit off the rails, that none of what Josh and I talked about is the official view of the Department of Defence, the Australian Federal Police, or of any of the organisations we've talked about. It is simply the world according to the two of us there. When I have referred to what we know about the evidence, that is based on research evidence. But again, we're not speaking for any specific organisations.